All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our presentation today, The State of Layoffs and Career Mobility 2023 Career Transition Trends. Few housekeeping items before we get started. All lines are on mute. We have reserved time at the end to answer questions, but we also want this to be an interactive conversation. So please enter questions or comments into the Q&A box when prompted to do so. Will we send out a copy of this presentation at the end? We will. We absolutely will. We will also send links to all the research cited throughout the discussion. I am so pleased to introduce today's speakers. Greg Simpson is Senior Vice President and Global Career Transition Practice Leader. Melanie Stave is Senior Vice President and North American Development and Mobility Practice Leader. That is a mouthful. That's why we use so many acronyms here at LHH. Greg, I'm going to hand it over you to get us started.
Wonderful. And this is great to get an opportunity to speak with all of you today. And as Kate was saying, we hopeful that this is going to be an interactive session. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing a lot of the research findings that we found and what we see as some interesting conclusions, and also kind of pointing out the unique place that we feel all of us are in globally in the talent marketplace. So what we're going to be looking at is kind of a range of what we see are existential threats that are currently facing the global labor market. There is a sense of sudden job loss amidst the pandemic and global skill shortage that we've been experiencing, and how employees actually, they're concerned for layoffs, the impacts that this is having within the workforce. But what's different today? And there are some misconceptions and some actual kind of disagreements that we see between major groups within organizations when it comes to preparing for layoffs, how layoffs are experienced and their effect on the organization. But we're feeling as LHH, we are, one of the world's largest career management firms. We see 2023 as a marked difference and a real change in how the experience of the employee is while at work. And we're going to be talking about some recommendations to be looking at about how managing a reduction in force, how should we look at, and hopefully what we're going to have is a broader conversation about what to do actually before, during, after facing times of disruption. So first, let's kind of take a look at what was the baseline of our research. And on the next slide, what we see is that there were two primary groups that were surveyed, and that included over 2,500 HR leaders from organizations that had over 500 employees. That also included over 7,000 white-collar workers that were also included. That was across 5 countries. So this is a terrific cross-section about what we're seeing here. But as we go into the research, what we want to be able to understand is what is the unique context and what are the unique time that this research was actually conducted? Because we have seen significant shifts in the last 12 months. The change in feeling of the global workforce has been a near 180-degree shift. So let's take a look at that, a little bit of what we see here. We feel, and have been analyzing in 2023, that there was a whiplash and then a global sense of anxiety. So just practically in the blink of an eye, there was a global labor market where it went from 4 million people quitting their jobs in what was being called the Great Resignation. That was going on, at this point just last year. And then as we started getting into the fourth quarter of 2022, what we saw was the beginning of over 100,000 people in the technology industry losing their jobs. And now, as we look at this as measured by the Edelman Trust Barometer, fear of job loss is ranking higher than any economic or societal existential fear. So what changed as we look at this shift and this, in essence, overwhelming sense of anxiety? And this next slide, please. It was the convergence of multiple factors that came in. So you had raising interest rates that then put the slowdown on money and investment of hiring. But this was also going during a time of where digital transformation has already been changing the nature of jobs, AI coming onto the scene and accelerating that. All of this kind of accumulating in what resulted in an overwhelming shared anxiety, a crisis of confidence in personal career management. And this is both the individuals who are losing their jobs, but we have to understand, and this is what a big part of the research that we're seeing, it permeates more than ever into the remaining talent within organizations. And this is a critical point that all of us have to be able to recognize. So, as we look like, and where layoffs has been, and just a statement here is just that we also see that layoffs will probably continue through the remainder of this year and possibly at a fairly strong pace into the first quarter of the next year. It isn't just big tech. We have been working with organizations that have been in financial services, manufacturing, media, hospitality, and restaurant services, transportation, oil and gas, healthcare, hospital. There is hardly an industry that has not been affected by this. My assumption is the majority of the people attending this call, you have had your own experience with this. And I'm sorry, as we go forward and kind of look at the first point we want to ask on a poll here is there a sense of anxiety and or burnout at your organization? If you wouldn't mind just going ahead and clicking here or putting in comment in the comment box, we would love to see your responses to this. Is this generating? Is this ongoing for you? Do you see this? Do you feel that your organization or possibly your industry is insulated or possibly experiencing it more than others? So we really love to see, some of the comments here. Kate, when we have some and we can show it to the audience, would be wonderful. 88%. So an interesting point. Yes. So this is really meant, again, to establish the context for our conversation and where we are today. So we are now in alignment with most of the research that we have seen, as well as this group here today, that this is now permeating. Now that goes beyond the idea of the organization itself. So layoffs are widespread. Yes, 77% of individuals that were surveyed are saying in the HR that they are undertaking or considering layoffs. So this is across multiple industries in 6 different countries. What's driving it? And I think off the top, considering where we were a year ago, yes, one of the biggest is overhiring over the past years. But then cost-cutting imperatives as business is changing. Restructuring an reorganization caused by some of that cost-cutting initiative. Poor business performance, as we're seeing businesses being outdated or the way that they're doing business. And then M&A, merger and acquisition, causing duplication is always going to be one of the biggest disrupting factors here that goes on. So when we look at this and we start to maybe say, is this an isolated point in 2023 of a reduction in force? Given where the global labor market is and the speed of change, we're probably going to see a lot of these economic drivers going to be continuing. So we have to be prepared, and we need to be looking at this in the best lens possible. So when we look at this and we say, so I'm sorry, let's go to that poll. So from that, when surveyed, what percent of our HR leaders really concerned about layoffs themselves? So those are the drivers. What percent of HR is showing that they have concerns about how a layoff is going to affect their organization or your organization? What percent of you believe, from looking at our research, how many people you think said that HR is concerned? We'll go ahead and we'll put that poll up in just a moment when we get some responses here. Kate, I feel like we're asking you to open up door number one.
I like to wait until we have a critical mass. So we're
Okay,
at about 60%. So let's see what we've got.
terrific. Okay, good. So a spread here where, of what people think the research is showing, maybe 32% is showing that there's concern, maybe, again, 57% there, showing more concern. And then only 14% saying that, the majority, 99% of HR leaders saying that they have concern how the organization is going to be affected by a layoff. Let's go actually to the survey. And what it has said is 99% of HR leaders said they have a concern regarding layoffs at their organization. And so let's look at what concerns the research was pointing out that the HR leaders are saying that they have. And the first two, inability to achieve the business objectives. So we're talking about going into a layoff, during a layoff, and after a layoff, a significant concern about being able to achieve current business objectives. Additionally, with that equally is going to be trouble hiring, recruiting new talent due to skill shortage and low unemployment. Almost identical is concerned about lawsuits going on in litigation, happening from going through a significant reduction in force, disengagement equal to that, and then an increase in resignations of individuals who the organization is trying to retain. So again, kind of showing a concern regarding the individuals there that are, retaining the talent. So an interesting point that, we're seeing what are the real drivers, but is there something, what we looked at, was there something missing from this category that as we look as professionals in the talent management business, as we work with organizations globally, we found there was an interesting omission. So the research points out that only 6% of HR leaders cite burnout as a risk of during layoffs. So an interesting point here, because it kind of stood out from the data from us. And we work with a lot of individuals, like many of you here who are on the webinar here today. And we see a lot of honest effort going in, making sure that well-being is being taken care of here. But it's very interesting because here's the first kind of I think a big point of our research that points out. On the next slide we see is, well, how do workers feel about this? So only 6% of HR leaders are citing this risk of burnout, but 72% of the same organizations, of the workers in the same organization, are saying that they are experiencing burnout. So there is now kind of a disconnect that we start to be able to see between the two groups here. And we would love to be able to kind of learn more about this. I kind of want to turn to my colleague Melanie here. Melanie, you're a global leader in our talent mobility business. Do you see organizations recognizing burnout well-being as an issue to solve for within their own organizations?
Thank you, Greg. And yes, absolutely. Resilience, embracing change, coaching, these are all key programs that companies really need to enable, and they do enable to help their workforce settle in, settle their minds, hopefully bring them a little more peace to become less anxious around layoffs and engagements like this, so that they can start to process that action that happened to them. So yes, it is definitely key for them to accomplish their business objectives. And actually, given this large disconnect that we see between the 6% and the 72%, we are honestly really interested in your perspectives on why this could be. So if you would, for a little bit of engagement back and forth, we'd appreciate if you could pull up the Q&A section on the screen and perhaps provide some of your thoughts in the box on why that disconnect could be occurring. And further to that, also start to think about well-being. Where does well-being land in your organization? Do you feel employee well-being is a business objective? Do you believe employee well-being is tied to some other concern within the company? We'd love to get your thoughts and see what you're thinking on this.
Also, additionally, that we would, like to understand if there was any comment or opinion, is this HR's issue to solve? Or is well-being, managing burnout, should that be within the organization, within the management of the individuals, as opposed to the responsibility of HR? So again, this is what we feel is a very critical point. Would love to see any comments that you might have on this subject.
Do have a couple of comments. One is a matter of bandwidth, that there is so much going on. There's not enough time to reflect on the bigger picture. There's just too little time. That workers may not voice how they're feeling to their HR leaders because they're afraid of the vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, HR is not in touch. We hear that. Do you think I mean, Melanie and Greg, you're working with organizations every day. Do you think that HR is out of touch with the way that employees are feeling?
I think I learned to that first comment. What I do see a lot in what we're working with is we do experience an enormous amount of pressure within the HR groups.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
It is very difficult for them to be able to, they're looking at the primary business objectives, but downstream, longer term effects when things like burnout and well-being, they're large issues to try and solve for. And a lot of times HR is during times of disruption is in essence really just trying to manage to the end of the day with the workloads that they have and hitting the business objectives that they've been given. That's a lot of what we would. Melanie, do you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do think a lot of times as well that HR does have the information and they have created great, knowledge for people and sharing that with them. But sometimes it just doesn't get communicated as far out as one would assume or one would like. So I do think a lot of effort does go into that, but sometimes it just doesn't reach the audience.
And HR has responsibility for creating the framework and providing tools, but the managers are responsible as well. So that's something we talked about earlier, the three of us. How much of this is to HR? How much of this really does fall to the managers to engage?
Right.
And then HR is often burned out too. We see that a lot, right?
Very
You have to
true.
put your own oxygen mask on first, right? HR is not
Perfect.
in a position of influence, right? So that we've had a couple people comment, is the CEO involved? How much do they care about this? Fair.
Well, the
Thank you
key
very
point
much
that
for
we went, and
sharing.
without belaboring it here, is it jumped off the screen on the data to us, is the disconnect. And let's go back up to the original point. We're dealing now with a workforce that is experiencing greater anxiety than they ever have. Now we have to recognizing that there's a bit of a disconnect in how they feel about this. It in essence starts to be looking at a situation that we see growing across multiple organizations in almost every industry. So it's a point to be able to recognize. We're talking about how we adjust and how we manage, reductions in force in the future. It's now a new dynamic that we're now paying attention to. So an excellent point here. So
exactly. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Kate. So yes, to continue on that sentiment, employees are feeling anxious. Each of these data points takes us right back to what Greg just said, right back at the start of our discussion, that there is this shared sense of anxiety. You can see here that 63% of workers are worried about the economy and recent layoff news. 47% are worried that layoffs will impact their future job prospects, and 38% are just simply worried that they're going to get laid off. Layoffs has always concerned people, but 2023, as we heard earlier, is definitely a different year than others due to that conversion of factors of high interest rates and the changing nature of work, both being affected by automation and from AI, which causes even more anxiety for someone when looking for a job. So when you combine employees feeling anxious and retention strategies that might not be working as planned, and Kate, if we could move to the next slide, This just adds to their dismay. So here again, we see a little bit of a disconnect. 81% of HR leaders believe existing retention strategies are effective, yet 57% of workers are considering leaving their jobs. So again, HR has the information clearly because they're saying they've got strategies, but that information is not getting to the employees. They're not seeing it. And in times of a layoff, this also makes the employer brand that much more brittle as it highlights the problem that there is a lack of communication and a communication around internal career movement itself. We could go to the next slide. This is a great comparison on why employees stay or leave, and further reasoning on why you need to start to look at things differently going forward. To me, key items that stand out in the reasons to leave column are that desire to change, wanting to gain new skills, and having a company culture that supports career. Those are three new things that are, to me, fantastic to see on that list for reasons to leave, because it really hammers home people like their jobs. When you look at the reasons to stay, you see culture twice: having a culture that supports career and skill development, and a culture where one can advance their career. People really want to stay in their companies and develop. They want to learn new skills. They want to know they don't need to leave in order to grow their career. This is something that we see more and more and more of across the past few years, and it's just becoming more pronounced today. To bring this back around, remember that when a layoff occurs, not having that culture supportive of mobility and development will further exacerbate the situation.
So now when we start looking at the recommendations, that when we've looked at this research and again, in the context that your organization may have already gone through, may be facing in the future, having a reduction in force, what's the number one piece of advice that we get? It's leading with empathy. And this is where a big change that we've seen. And when we look and analyze in the first quarter of this year, unfortunately, what we saw was the backlash of not paying attention to these primary issues. Some organizations went through a destructive experience with their employer brand. So when you look and understanding, where is the level of job loss when someone looks at the biggest fears that they're facing, you're looking at, that job loss ranks as one of the biggest events that an individual can face. And again, this is accelerated by, our current time. So leading with empathy, understanding the organization, this comes from the communication leading up to the event, how you're communicating at the point of notification, what services that you're providing, how the managers are prepared to be able to deliver this message. What is the CEO, the primary leaders of the organization, are they being primed and trained to understand what is empathetic leadership? Additionally, the next is that we have a communication issue that's going on. And what we're looking at here is then when we look at the available resources that employees have available to them, yet, what employees feel that are available to them, that how they can find them, there's a big disconnect on the communication of support that is available. So, this is something that as you go in and we're looking in disruption, how is your communication when you're talking about the efforts that you already have in place? Now, from our industry standpoint, we can tell you that 81% of organizations actually, can reduce time to hire for individuals going through a reduction in force by 81% when you're supported by outplacement. But, the other services and support that's available in mental health and mentoring and career coaching and letters of recommendations, these types of things are not actually coming all the way through. It's in essence developing this culture that Melanie was just talking about that gives greater flexibility and greater transparency to things that are already in place and the hard work a lot of the people here on this call have already done. Then thirdly, the third recommendation we would say is from our standpoint, the alternatives to layoffs. I have looked at the global career transition market for over 20 years and have analyzed multiple industries in some of the biggest multinational corporations in the world. My personal opinion is, if you're looking to improve the leaving experience of any individual, it is to adapt a culture of mobility within the organization before a layoff is ever faced. So as you can see here, 43% of workers, they're concerned about their skills, but then 59, almost 60%, said they'd like to develop their careers, but they don't know, what to pursue. So support needs to be able to be coming in, and that culture of mobility is this attitude that changes the perspective of the individual. And individuals now need to be inspired to new career paths that they may not have ever considered in the past. Then they're of more value and understand, well, their skill sets could be played internally within the organization. They can manage their careers better. Should they end up being affected in a reduction in force, they're already prepared to understand where their careers could be taken. And I think that this, when we look at what I feel and our organization feels, is going to be a continued time of disruption. I think it's really critical that we now start to broaden the lens of who was affected actually by a layoff and the long-term effects of the organization. So, Melanie, we're kind of moving into your world here a little bit more about talent mobility.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. And let's continue with our recommendations of that thought around effective communication, and also looking at internal mobility alternatives, meaning alternatives to layoffs, that internal mobility and reskilling as alternatives. So I'd love to do two quick polls. So Kate, we can go back to the poll. This first one, what % of HR leaders say they have effectively built a culture where employees can easily grow their careers as part of their retention strategy? You see our 5 choices. So if you would, just pick one in there. And we'll see how this connects back to what you're thinking, to what we've seen in our research as well. How are we looking, Kate? Oh, looks good. All right, so our biggest group here, so we've got 43%, 37% say 43%. Perfect, and we've got some at 9, some at 60. Okay, let's see the correct response here. 81%. So this was the result that we had in our data research that we did. So to me, as career development and mobility practice leader, this is great, because this means that there's processes, guidance, materials that you have developed, and it's all ready to go, which is fantastic. So let's go on to the next poll. Slightly different question. What % of HR leaders say they have effectively built a culture where upskilling and or retraining is encouraged or rewarded? Let's see what you think here. Again, slightly different question, but similar idea from HR's perspective. All right. Most around the 32%, 17, 57, okay. And the answer is 80%. So again, very positive. And to me, again, this means that managers, employees are both engaged. If skilling or retraining is encouraged or rewarded, mobility must be happening, and it is supported, which is super. So now keep these high ratings in mind as we go to the next slide. So with results so high from those polls, why do we see that only 33% of employees say their culture supports job mobility? 42% of employees are interested in changing roles, but they don't know how to. And the #1 barrier to mobility is managers who do not encourage movement. So while the organizations might be saying the right things or think they have the right tools in place, their employees aren't seeing it, which highlights another potential disconnect in communication, which hopefully can be avoided with the right direction, which brings us to our next slide. Here, we thought it would be helpful to provide some recommendations in building that talent mobility culture. Each of these steps require clear direction and communication so both employees and managers know what the plan is and what their part is within the plan. It might seem very daunting at first if there are no steps that you have in place that are around this, but when you read each and digest each action alone and then put them together, it should just feel like a natural, thoughtful progression of events, each setting the foundation for the next to be successful. So you literally start by defining and creating the culture, which is a big undertaking. I personally would say that's probably the most difficult, is to get everybody on board, from senior leadership, HR, talent acquisition, L&D, everybody being on that same page and agreeing and defining the culture. Once that's in place, you establish processes, which opens the door for more frequent career conversations between employees and managers. And then that discussion around what a potential next career move might look like happens more frequently and more naturally. All of this leads to having a shared responsibility, which is the employee owning their career, the manager supporting their development, and the organization providing the learning resources and processes to make all of this work. One more thing with regards to career possibilities specifically, let's flip to the next slide so we can see what these movements look like today. Naturally, people assume the only way to grow their career is to get a promotion, which typically isn't the case anymore. Today, we are seeing a lot more ways to achieve career growth than before. You could do a lateral move, which is move to a new role at the same level. You could do enrichment, which is you remaining in your current role while developing skills and capabilities. You can do exploration, which is while you're in your current role, you're gaining exposure to a new area through special assignments or project work, which is also known as gig work today. Then there is the vertical move, which is the typical promotion. We also have realignment, which is a shift to a lower level position with a different scope of responsibilities or areas of interest. We actually see that happening more often now for people who are been doing a job for 10 years, 20 years, and they're finally looking at themselves and saying, what is it that I really like to do? It's something over there, but they don't have experience in it. So a lot of people are actually taking that lower level position in an area that they really enjoy for better satisfaction, but then hopefully to move up in that side. And then finally, we have relocation, which is a geographic or cross-functional move, or departing from the organization altogether. But when you build a talent mobility culture, if an organization is clear on how it defines mobilities, employees will hopefully see there is more movement than they originally thought, and they don't have to leave the company to grow their career. If this mindset is in place and part of the culture, when a disruption occurs, employees should hopefully feel less anxious and that there might be an alternative for them within the company. Next slide, Kate.
So in a summation of what we're seeing across the board here is looking at reduction in force, how it is managed today in the year of 2023, and what we see will probably be going on into the future is organizations are going to emerge from this more nimble as they manage their workforce. Is if you're looking at possibly moving and having to be affected by a reduction in force, it's to look at this broader. It used to be that we would just look how HR was building out the programs to be able to support the exiting employees. But if we look at the primary reasons, what HR leaders are saying, achieving business objectives, maintaining an ability to keep a talent pipeline running, managing the workforce more correctly. In order to be able to do that, you actually have to extend and broaden the stakeholders that are going to be involved in the planning and the involvement of reduction in force. That has to include now the senior leadership of the organization across the board, all the way down into the manager groups that are doing the notifications. Empathy, empathetic leadership, and the support of empathetic leadership is a hallmark in the success of organizations that are managing a reduction in force and disruption right now. But it also now, as we really wanted to be able to point out, we see that the best-in-class employers are putting in programs that support the retained talent within the organization before, during, and after, to be able to ensure that they are fully supported as they go through. And they're recognizing as a stakeholder recognizing that there is going to be burnout, that there is going to be concern, that there is already concern about job loss. And after an organization goes through a disruptive period, that only is being elevated. So in order to be able to achieve the business objectives that we see we're facing today, we take a broader lens in how we're approaching this and how the strategic discussion should be developing in order for you to be able to emerge from this, because there will be winners and losers. And what we are seeing is that there is great benefit going to the winners here and how talent is gravitating toward them, how they're going to be managing their businesses in the future. The overall culture of those organizations are tremendously healthy. So, there is very good news at the end of this. It's just a matter of broadening how we have looked at an issue in the past and how it's changed because of the current situation that we're all facing here. So this has been a review, again, of the research findings, our opinions that we have from, that we wanted to be able to share with you. What you shared with us is invaluable. Your insights, or your comments, we'll respond to all of it. So we do want to turn this now to more of an open Q&A. So Kate, if you want to manage how we go into our Q&A session, and any responses or any questions, Melanie and I are here and happy to answer.
Yeah, there is a question, and I don't know that we have the answer to this, but somebody's asking about statistics from actual senior leadership, CEOs. Are they perceiving burnout? Perhaps the issue is that, the ivory tower of the CEO that maybe doesn't actually know what's happening on the ground.
There is some research that we can point to that talks about, I think where it leads to is we have validated that talent retention and talent acquisition is within the top 5 primary concerns of leadership that's within the C-suite. So you can tie that to the ideas that anything that would affect that is of concern. I think this is an excellent question, because when you tie the two together, many times when we talk to HR professionals, they looked at presentations like this or support. How can they communicate this to their senior leadership, that it is a concern and could affect larger business objectives? So it's an excellent question. I would say that I think if they aren't fully concerned, that the ground is very fertile for them to be able to listen to how it could possibly be affecting the larger business objectives.
Mm-hmm.
Kate, I'd like to call out one note that was put in here too. It says, for everybody, we have engaged a work population where retention has improved. 2 years ago, that was not the case. Retention plan was utilizing the pulse survey and being deliberative in action plans to address what employees were saying. I will say that doing those type of pulse surveys and engagement surveys frequently throughout the year, especially in the past couple of years we've had, has been a honest, surefire way to see what your people are thinking. So it's fantastic that you did that and that you were able to action something and put plans in place to address what they were saying. And it looks like you were successful, as you have been able to increase retention. So thank you for stating that. I appreciate it.
That's great. We have somebody here talking about empathy, separating empathy from emotional well-being. And I think they're talking about empathy being more of a wallowing with the employee. And that's not what we mean when we talk about empathy. They're saying, well-being is giving them tools to help. Empathy is getting in there with them. And I don't think that that's what we mean when we talk about empathetic leadership. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about kind of broadly speaking, what are we talking about when we say empathetic leadership?
It's an excellent point. I think when we talk about empathetic leadership, one is recognizing that there's elevated senses of concern. It's the idea, what we're seeing is that if you're looking to be able to to manage this effectively, employees want to be heard now more than ever. And is there a sense that their concerns or their desires actually can be expressed and can be expressed safely? That is a sign of empathy. If there's a culture of inclusion, that is that show of it. So it kind of gets you out of that, like I say, a little bit of that ivory tower. That's where the sensitivity pieces have to come in. we have additional research that we could share with the group that also shows that there are, there's primary psychological needs that are being tied to a lot of the issues that employees are facing right now. And now it's affecting a crisis of confidence. Individuals who go through career transition today actually carry a larger emotional burden and can carry that burden into their new job and affect the way that they're actually performing. I think empathetic leadership is you understand the level of that, understand what support programs could be put in place, not so much wallowing in it as to provide the effective tools that could be addressing it.
Great, thank you so much. And how about layoffs for remote employees? Do we have recommendations, best practices? Is this fundamentally different than in person? Can you speak to that at all?
Yes. And when you tie that a little bit to empathy, there are situations here today where, an individual's relationship with their employer is extremely tight. And we've always talked about a psychological bond that is between the employee and the employer. Certain organizations have incredible senses of employee brand and employer brand. So when they are a part of the organization, it's really a part of their life. And the message is being delivered over a medium like we're having right now. And then after the message is delivered, the screen goes blank and they're left alone. That is a remote separation event. It is a different event. There isn't an opportunity to be able to share. I think some of the key pieces that we've done as in our organization is many times that we are available on day of notification to be immediately the next person they speak to, so that there is a sense of connection. There's an ability to download. There's an ability to process the event. In a remote employee, you don't want to disregard the sense of isolation and the effect of the news has on the employee. So these are new pieces that we are coming in play. And yes, there are some additional tactics, like I said, being able to have a third party that's available. Also how HR could be providing, different types of orientation sessions and things, but not leaving the individual in absolute isolation, particularly if there is a strong sense of employer brand and connection between the employee and the organization.
That's great. Thank you, Greg.
Kate, I actually see a question on here too, if I may.
Oh, great. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah. How does leadership prepare organizations for M&A with having to deal with the unknown of the future? That is a question that a lot of our clients do ask us. And one of the best things to do is to start thinking about how to make your employees who may or may not be affected specifically, they're all going to be affected in one way, but how do we help them become resilient? How do you help them be prepared for the change that's going to happen? So doing some discussions or workshops or webinars around resiliency, around embracing unexpected change, starts to help them think about how to prepare themselves for something that might be occurring. It's a very tough situation to have, but having more proactive sessions around that type of topic out there will just help people to start to prepare and get themselves ready for something that might be coming.
Great. And here's one from somebody who is actually in a career transition and mobility role. And they're asking the best way to support individuals who have experienced a role elimination. What are the main focus areas there?
Clarifying the question to how to support an individual who has been notified.
Yes.
I think, again, begin with the end in mind. And that is, for one, how is the manager who's going to be delivering that news been prepared, and how that news is going to be supported. Understanding, is there support that is going to be provided to the individual? But two, the other part of our survey is kind of pointing out there's a big disconnection with the communication of what's available. I would say that clarity is your greatest asset. And I think what you really are looking for is to find ways that we can make sure that that individual knows that the support that's available and then is provided with that as soon as possible. we see a definite correlation between the time that something is clearly communicated to the, as close as possible to the separation event, the notification, and the beginning of those services, that individual is better prepared to be able to carry through. So it's really a timing issue. I think that's really the way you want to look at it. Communication, how quickly and how clearly will you get the support to the person?
Great.
I see another question in here, Kate. How is the return to office impacting employee engagement and anxiety? That's a really good question. And I have seen positive and I have seen negative of one, just overall going back to the office. But once people are in and they get that camaraderie back and they're with their colleagues and they're with their friends and they're starting to meet back in person, the natural way things used to be of engagement seem to start to progress and they seem to start to be happier. For a layoff to occur, the anxiety still is in that same bucket of where it is. So we still need to be cautious and do the right things to try and squash, for lack of technical term, the anxiety as much as possible. But definitely, I do see the engagement of people going back into the workforce is having a positive effect on well-being and connection back to the company.
Great, thank you. Some of these questions are very specific. So I don't want to throw them out there. I think a lot of them are going to depend upon the context of your organization. But Melanie, Greg, if there's any, some talking about the day of the week to notify folks, whether they're in an at-home day or whether they're in the office. I'll throw those out to you if you want to answer. I think that probably a lot of it, like I said, is going to depend upon the context of your organization, but I'll throw it back to you.
I would say that the kind of almost the answer is yes. That it has to be it's based on the culture of the organization, how you've already been managing the workforce remotely or in an in-office situation. I think that this is where talking with a third-party firm is an excellent idea to understand. How do you look at the analysis of your organization? What's the best plan that individually is going to be from you? How are they looking at communication? Is there opportunities to elevate and build the trust with executive leadership and how they're communicating the information? What support pieces are going to be in place? So I believe that we've seen some of the best organizations, really look at their own culture uniquely, operate within it. That's what feels best to the employee. I think some of the best organizations in the world that I see that manage this, they look at it and to say that the experience of leaving the organization should be as fully supported and feel as when they were in the organization. And I think that that's the high bar that you want to be able to set. And because what you're dealing with, particularly in a remote separation, is that feeling of isolation that'll happen so quickly. But if your programs are designed in a way to be communicated and be supportive of the person, where they actually feel and know that that organization is supporting them after their last day worked, then you have a much better experience for the person leaving. But I cannot emphasize how much it will affect the people who are remaining in the organization to know that that was the person's experience. It's critical that way today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to call that a wrap. Melanie, Greg, thank you so much for sharing this information with us. For everyone on the call, I will send a follow-up communication later this week. It will have the presentation as well as the research that we discussed. So thank you so much and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.